Good evening, everybody. It's wonderful to see so many people here tonight. Great. Thank you all for coming, and of course a special thanks to our 5 speakers for offering to address us here tonight. My name is Karen Marrick. I'm from the Canberra Refugee Action Committee, and I'll be chairing tonight's forum, which has been jointly organised by the Refugee Action Committee and the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture. Our topic tonight is refugees, what would Jesus do, what should we do? And it's our sincere hope that by the end of this evening, all of you will be inspired to join the campaign to change Australia's current refugee policy. It seems particularly appropriate that we should be here tonight discussing this, given that last week witnessed unprecedented brutality in the detention centre on Manus Island. This brutality saw scores of asylum seekers injured from attacks with machetes, rocks and guns. Worse, this brutality led to the death of a 23-year-old Iranian man, Reza Barati, a man who had the misfortune to come to Australia by boat seeking help. We, the Australian public, still don't know exactly what happened on Manus Island last Monday because our government is still blocking journalists from accessing the camp. We do know that there are currently more than 1,300 asylum seekers in the Manus Island Detention Centre, and we do know that some of them have been there since late 2012. We also know from a whistleblower who worked for the Immigration Department until the brutality on the island compelled her to speak out, that the unrest was sparked when detainees were pressured to voluntarily return to their homelands and told there was no prospect of resettlement in Australia. We also know that Australia is signatory to the 1951 United Nations Refugee Convention, which makes it clear that seeking asylum is not illegal, it is a human right. We know too that more than 90% of those who come to Australia by boat are eventually found to be genuine refugees. We know that the numbers of people seeking asylum here is far from the flood some politicians would have us believe, that the numbers are in fact so small that the current refugee quota in Australia is 1 refugee for every 1,700 Australians, a rate that puts us 49th in the world in the total number of refugees we resettle and 87th in the world when ranked by our GDP. We know all this, but still we are led by a Prime Minister whose response to last week's brutality was to say that he will not succumb to moral blackmail when it comes to Australia's refugee policy, nor will he be deterred or intimidated. We currently spend about $2.5 billion a year to show the most vulnerable people on the planet how tough we are. We're lining the pockets of private contractors like G4S that provide so-called security and safety to these people. We hardly even need Reza Barati's tragic death to remind us that this is not money well spent. This is money spent to destroy Australia's reputation and standing in the global community, to incite countries like China and Indonesia, whose human rights records we've traditionally deplored, to justly decry our current treatment of refugees, to bring us into a position where organisations like the United Nations and Amnesty International publish scathing reports of the cruel conditions in Australia's detention camps. This is not money well spent. And yet still Tony Abbott says he will not be deterred. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that after tonight we too can all say, neither will we. Over the course of this evening, we're going to hear 5 speakers give their thoughts on refugees, what would Jesus do, what should we do? Our first speaker will be Bishop Stephen Pickard, the Executive Director of the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture, followed by Reverend Myung Park, Moderator-elect of the Uniting Church Synod of New South Wales and ACT, Monsignor John Woods from the Catholic Archdiocese of Canberra and Goulburn, Reverend Chris Turner, Senior Minister at the Canberra Baptist Church, and finally Eileen O'Brien from the Refugee Action Committee. After the speakers have finished, there will be an opportunity for discussion and questions, and we'll also serve tea and coffee at the end of the forum for those who would like to stay and chat for longer. Before we begin, I'd also like to introduce and acknowledge the joint organisers of tonight's forum. The Refugee Action Committee in Canberra is a completely voluntary group of concerned citizens seeking the fair and humane treatment of refugees in Australia. We are working to raise public awareness about the government's obligations to give refuge to asylum seekers and treat them properly. We have no political affiliations. We are composed of people from a range of backgrounds and interest groups, and we work with any person or organisation willing to help achieve the committee's aims. We receive no government or any other funding and depend entirely on donations and members' credit cards to meet our running costs. If you would like to help with some of these costs, please place a donation in one of the buckets you see tonight. You should also have been given a sign-up sheet when you entered the chapel. Please fill in your name, email address and phone number so we can keep you informed about future Refugee Action Committee events. The Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture is an ecumenical foundation reflecting the faith background of around 14 million people, or 70% of the Australian population. Amongst the Centre's priorities are interfaith dialogue and the relationship of theology to social issues. The Centre has been in operation since 1993, and its constituency comprises the majority of Christian churches in Australia, including all members of the National Council of Churches. Given the Centre's emphasis on the relationship of theology to social issues, it seems apt that we should be holding this forum in the Centre's chapel tonight, and that our first speaker should be the Centre's current director. The Right Reverend Professor Stephen Pickard was appointed Executive Director of the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture in September 2013. Prior to taking up that role, Dr. Pickard was the head of the School of Theology at Charles Sturt University from 1998 to 2006. In 2007, Dr. Pickard was consecrated Bishop in Adelaide, and he has held a host of senior positions in the Anglican Church. He has also served as a professorial fellow at Oxford. The author of several books, including In Between God, Theology, Community and Discipleship, he has previously given sermons and participated in forums examining Australia's handling of asylum seekers and refugees from ethical and Christian perspectives. Thank you, Dr. Pickard.
On behalf of the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture, I welcome you to this place tonight. Those who come to this land are seeking asylum, those who seek refuge and desire to find a home here, they, like us, are guests of this remarkable land. We are all guests here for a time and a season. The first people of this land travelled from another place thousands of years ago. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet tonight. I also pay respect to the elders, both past and present, and extend this respect to other Indigenous Australians who may be present. Why are we here tonight? Those who have no helpers and defenders need advocates and companions. That is why I am with you tonight, and that is why I care. Why do you care? And what are you going to do? In my brief remarks, I want to set the scene for my colleagues who will follow. First of all, asylum seekers are those who seek sanctuary and security, a safe place where they cannot be seized, taken hostage or harmed. Such an irony in asylum seekers. Like many words in our language, asylum comes from a Greek word, asylon, and sil means right of seizure, and asylum means without right of seizure. In other words, protected and cared for. We have a fundamental responsibility to protect and care for those seeking asylum for fear of persecution on the basis of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion. This moral obligation has its spiritual and ethical basis in the long-held conviction that this world and all of its creation does not belong to us, it is gift. It comes to us as a gift from a good God. In particular, that human beings are made in the image of God. Asylum seekers and refugees are made in the image of God. That is their primary and fundamental and enduring status. Before they are asylum seekers, before they are refugees, before they are identified in any way that separates and distances them from us, there is something far more fundamental. We share a common humanity, a common identity as image bearers of the divine life. This is basic to the Christian tradition, no matter what church we belong to. And it goes even deeper into our common heritage. Indeed, my friends, this origin lies deep in the people of Israel and the Jewish religion. The Jewish religious tradition. An interfaith representative from the Canberra Jewish community, Mr. Harry Opperman, wrote to me yesterday to lend his support to this gathering. He's out of town tonight and sends his apologies. He reminds us that hospitality to the stranger has been a fundamental axiom of the Jewish religion for thousands of years. And he reminded me of Leviticus, as you all know, chapter 19, verse 34. Thou shalt love the stranger as thyself. If you don't remember anything else from I say, go and read Leviticus as you do regularly. Chapter 19, verse 34. Thou shalt love the stranger as thyself. The Talmud, or the oral law, mentions that the precept to love or not to oppress the stranger occurs 36 times throughout the Jewish teachings. And the rabbis explain that nothing should be done to annoy or injure the stranger, or even by word to offend their feelings. The fact that someone is a stranger in the midst should in no way justify treatment other than that enjoyed by brethren in the race. We are all made in the image of God. This is the great tradition that feeds us. And it is easily forgotten that Jesus was a Jew. The Gospels of the Jewish Jesus tell the story of someone who offered hospitality to the stranger, the outcast, the despised. Jesus was always crossing boundaries to search for those in need and needing sanctuary. You do not hear from his lips phrases like sovereign borders. His agenda was the goodness of the sovereign God of his life and all people. In the Gospels, people were always breaking into his life and space, intruders without a name. Out of desperate need, they would come through rooftops, thrust through a crowd, call out along the side of the road, making fools of themselves, and suffer public humiliation. In short, whatever it takes to seek healing, care and protection. Jesus didn't regard them as queue jumpers or illegals. He had compassion on the people, especially the mistreated and suffering, and especially women and children. The Gospels of Jesus are a manifesto for asylum seekers and refugees. They are a manifesto for the way we ought to regard such fellow human beings. The Gospels offer a moral framework for our common humanity. At the heart of the Gospel is Jesus' life of hospitality to the stranger. And it got him into trouble. A lot of trouble. His ministry was among the strangers and the outcasts, and that defined his life. Why? Because it was in his blood. He came from refugee stock. As a young child, Jesus became a displaced person. His parents fled to Egypt to escape the ruthless violence of the King Herod. He was a child refugee. He was taken to a foreign country without passport and parents who had little to show that they could support themselves in another place. He didn't travel by plane. He didn't travel by car or train. He didn't even go by boat. It was probably a camel. Was he an illegal? Did the Egyptian authorities send him to another country to be processed? It sounds so absurd, doesn't it? Outsourcing care quickly becomes abdication of responsibility. Born in a food trough, he spent his early years as a refugee in a foreign land, clearly cared for and protected. And when it was safe, he returned to his country of origin, but even then he had to settle in a different place from which he had come for safety's sake. His identity was shaped from earliest days as a stranger and asylum seeker and a refugee, and he died an outcast for the sake of others. So befriending the asylum seeker and the refugee, welcoming those that come to this place, is what we are called to do as followers of Jesus. Letting their voice be heard when they have no voice, their cries attended to when no one will hear, so that they can find consolation in their trauma and fear. I heard today that at St Paul's Cathedral in Melbourne, Anglican Cathedral in Melbourne, they've erected this monstrous banner over the front twin towers, as they often do, and it says, "Let's fully welcome refugees." What kind of welcome are we as a country giving them? Our stocks in the international community are quite low. I want to end these opening remarks with a somewhat free, and I hope the New Testament scholars around here will forgive me, a free adaptation of those haunting words of Jesus at the end of Matthew's Gospel. The subject, of course, is the final judgment. When the Son of Man comes in glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on the throne of glory. All the nations, including Australia, will be gathered before him. And the Lord will separate people and governments one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep at his right hand and the goats at the left. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, "Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was an asylum seeker, and you gave me safe haven in your own home. I didn't have a visa or a passport, but you treated me as a child of God. I was a stranger who couldn't speak the language, and you welcomed me with the language of love. I was frightened, and with barely the clothes on my back, and you clothed me with kindness and care. I had lost loved ones in conflicts and persecutions, and you comforted me. I was in detention and despairing of life itself, and you never gave up until I was freed." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when was it that we saw you, an asylum seeker, and welcomed you? Or without visa or passport, and treated you as a child of God? Or as a stranger of different race and language, sick, afraid, and we befriended you? In detention, and we became an advocate for your plight?" And the king will answer them, "Truly I say to you, just as you did it to the least of one of these asylum seekers and refugees, you did it to me." Jesus' mandate for this is haunting and powerful. So what will we do? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pickard. Our next speaker is Reverend Myung Park, Minister of St Columba's Uniting Church and Canberra City Uniting Church, and Moderator-elect of the Uniting Church Synod of New South Wales and the ACT. Reverend Park is a Korean Australian and the mother of 2 Korean-Irish Australian young women. Before coming to Australia, she worked in Pakistan as a missionary, where she met many refugees. She considers herself exceptionally lucky to have been influenced by 4 major religions in her life. She was born and raised in a Buddhist family before becoming a Christian, and has worked among Muslims and Hindus. As an ordained minister, she has served various multicultural congregations, where she has ministered to a number of refugees and asylum seekers. Reverend Park.
Thank you very much for a kind introduction. As someone who is a very late comer to this nation, I'm very, very honored to the people who have kept these wonderful countries and opened the welcoming and wonderful opening to me and to my children. And I especially acknowledging the Ngunnawal people, the elders, the past and also the future, the generation of this land. I would like to begin my talk by inviting you to join me in this prayer. Let us recite this prayer together. God bless our eyes so that we will recognize injustice. God bless our ears so that we will hear the cry of the stranger. God bless our mouths so that we will speak words of welcome to newcomers. God bless our shoulders so we will be able to bear the weight of struggling for justice. God bless our hands so that we can work together with all people to establish peace. Although I've been elected as Uniting Church Moderator last year and also in preparation for taking up the job, I am not really here as a kind of moderator elected, as official kind of form, however, just to make it a wonderful balance of the leadership of women and men in this platform. The Uniting Church in Australia, let me just give a little briefing of, I won't be able to bring the greetings on behalf of Uniting Church. However, I would like to share some of the Uniting Church nature, and also I'm proud to be part of it, so I would like to share some of it. Uniting Church in Australia was born in 1977 when the Congregational Union of Australia, the Methodist Church of Australia and the Presbyterian Church of Australia joined together to form the nation's only truly indigenous mainstream Christian movement. As you can see, the name Uniting. The Uniting Church shares with Australian people in the search for meaning, purpose, and the community in life. From its inception, it has been committed to justice and reconciliation between people. The Church considers that the world is a community in which all members are responsible for each other, and the strongest have a special responsibility for the vulnerable. Christianity teaches that all humanity will be judged by its attitude to neighbors, visitors, and the strangers. As a Christian church, we approach the issue of asylum seeker and refugee in the context of Hebrew history and the word of Jesus, which Stephen has already given us wonderful, wonderful depth of those meaning and the understanding. From its beginnings, the Hebrew history, the story was the story of people in exile, of alien resident in foreign land, suffering oppression and persecution. This history of exile and exodus, particularly the escape from the slavery in Egypt, revealed to the Israelites the nature of their God, God who cares for the exile and the persecuted refugees. Therefore, hospitality to the stranger became one of the strongest moral forces in ancient Israel. Then the Christian story continued to uphold God's call to solidarity with the homeless. Mary and Joseph were forced to take Jesus and hide in Egypt, as Herod sought to kill the baby Jesus Jesus traveled through strange land, choosing to spend time and share meals with the most marginalized people of his society. He called on people to love their enemies, give all they have to the poor, and offer hospitality to strangers. He taught that faithful obedience to God was marked by such deeds. In fact, it would be the way people responded to strangers and to the poor that would identify them as a people of faith. In this line of wonderful Christian tradition, there is no question about what Christian response should be to asylum seekers and refugees. The church is called to be a place of welcoming. As faithful disciples of Christ, we are to provide care and comfort to those who come to this land as strangers seeking safety, as Jesus did and would have done if he were here in our situation. In the statement to the nation made by very early at the inaugural assembly in 1977, Uniting Church promised to seek the correction of injustice wherever they occur, to work for the eradication of poverty and the racism within our society and beyond. And now you see, me as a Korean Australian can be elected as the moderator for the Synod, and to oppose all forms of discrimination which infringe basic rights and freedom. For the last 37 years, Uniting Church has been advocating for a just response to the needs of refugees with the public statements, support for refugees as an individual, as a church, as a body of the whole church, by putting submission, sending letters to the government, and the joint appeal to the Prime Minister. Also providing church members the action resources and fact sheets about the asylum seekers and refugees, and the worship and prayer resources. I believe that the rights of asylum seekers and refugees must be upheld at all times. Australia should fulfill Australia's obligation under the Convention and Protocol relating to the status of refugees. Unfortunately, our government failed the UN's protocol and turned the boat and led many asylum seekers facing with the perils of drowning. As a church, we had no other way to express our sense of despair than to lament the fact that Australia, a wealthy and a stable nation, is turning its back on people fleeing persecution and war. On Saturday, 3rd of August last year, state and national leaders of Uniting Church in Australia led a service of lament in Sydney CBD. And Eleni Paulus, the national director, said, "We express our sadness at the lack of compassion, hospitality, and generosity. Instead of offering protection and security to those who come seeking our help, we punish them with harsh and unforgiving policies." Australia is a wealthy country. It should uphold its responsibility for human rights and safety of all people, especially the little children. And Uniting Church proactively seek our government to carry out its policies and legislations to the rights and need of child asylum seekers and refugees. On 23rd November last year, congregations across Uniting Church in New South Wales and ACT met and put their gathered at the first Fleet Park to unfurl a giant quilt which made by 2,800 congregations across New South Wales and ACT. We stand for the refugee and asylum seekers. As truly multicultural church and also in this truly multicultural nation, we expect Australian response toward asylum seekers and refugees should be culturally sensitive. There should be no discrimination in treatment of asylum seekers, refugee and humanitarian entrants. Australia is a wonderful country. Yes, I came to Australia as a migrant myself and become an Australian citizen after 27 years. I know that there are many people like me who made Australia their home. I'm also aware that there are many migrants who came to this wonderful country by plane or by boat. Some came with a visa, some without visa. However, their aspiration to come to this country was to make a good life and make Australia their home. And I did. I made Australia even home for my children. How can I object others who want to have the same opportunity and who might have a more potential than me to contribute to this wonderful nation? What would Jesus do? May I invite you to join me once again with this prayer. Let us pray. God of hospitality and refuge, come to us here in this place of security and safety. Remind us that you are the God Almighty, large enough for all people, all nations, all tongues. Help us with the presence of your Holy Spirit to be able to create space for those who seek asylum and refuge. In the name of Jesus, your Son. Amen.
Thank you, Reverend Park. Now we're going to hear from Monsignor John Woods, the Vicar General of the Catholic Archdiocese of Canberra and Goulburn. Monsignor Woods has an undergraduate theology degree and a postgraduate degree in canon law or Catholic church law. He has been an assistant priest, the director of the marriage tribunal, a parish priest, a member of numerous archdiocesan committees, and for some 18 months, administrator of the Archdiocese until the installation of Archbishop Christopher Prowse last November. He also goes for the occasional jog or bike ride and enjoys being chaplain to the Canberra Raiders. While Monsignor Woods does not claim any expertise in matters pertaining to asylum seekers and refugees, he does presume to speak tonight as a concerned citizen and a professed Christian in a robust democracy. Thank you.
Carrying on from that last point, firstly, I do not presume to know, but I can speculate what Jesus would do about asylum seekers. I will do so with reference, in passing, to the sacred scriptures, church teaching, and some articles in last week's acclaimed national Jesuit journal, Eureka Street. In 1951, when the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, UNHCR, was established, there were 1.5 million refugees. 60 years later, there are an estimated 42.5 million forcibly displaced people around the world. Over 26 million were internally displaced persons, and over 15 million were refugees. At the time, there were 895,000 asylum seekers, that is, those seeking refugee status, and yet only 11% of these were registered with the UNHCR. In 2009, Prime Minister Gillard noted that Australia received only 0.6% of the world's asylum seekers. The vast majority of asylum seekers arrive in Australia by air, not boat. And yet relatively far more boat people have been granted refugee status subsequently. Nevertheless, a recent UMR national poll would have it that the majority of Australians believe that most boat arrivals were not genuine refugees, and that the government should be even more severe in their treatment. On the other hand, we paid scant notice to the 58,000 plus tourists and others who overstay their visas. Perhaps, as Fatima Misham suggested in Eureka Street, it is time to draw on sport and celebrity figures to push a message that it is not cool to be cruel. Australia is one of 20 nations to participate in the UNHCR's resettlement program. In 2011, we accepted the third largest number of refugees after the United States and Canada. Commendable as that program is, it resettles less than 1% of the world's refugees. In fact, most refugees stay within their region, fleeing to some of the world's poorest countries. Meanwhile, Australia's focus of late would seem to be policies and processes which avoid the international elephant in the room, the latest incarnation of which, sovereign borders, has implicitly turned an international right to seek asylum into an implicit national threat. Sovereign borders seems to blur the lines between a civilian and military authority, with implications well beyond this issue. Ray Casson, writing in last week's Eureka Street, pointed out that it is not really the people smugglers but the asylum seekers who are being targeted, quote, as enemy aliens violating Australian sovereignty, unquote. With the facts still emerging from the tragic Manus Island affray and the breakdown of the rule of law on Nauru still unresolved, the Australian Catholic Bishops Delegate for Migrants and Refugees, Bishop Gerard Hanna, said that how our government treats those in its care speaks to our community and internationally about what is acceptable in the treatment of our fellow human beings. The current asylum policy is undermining Australia's integrity and reputation in the international arena, as we've already heard. Australia is less a country of refuge, but increasingly one of restrictive policies, unquote. A consequence of these policies is to push to contract out our responsibilities. Of course, only yesterday we heard of the Foreign Minister making overtures to impoverish Cambodia to take refugees. Last Thursday we celebrated the United Nations World Day of Social Justice. Again in Eureka Street, David Hamilton, a Jesuit priest, noted that social justice is about giving to another their due. However, because social justice is seen as a debt, it is, quote, more effective to appeal to our individual generosity than our shared duty, and for religious leaders to be less comfortable speaking about justice than about love, unquote. As an aside, I referenced the renowned comment of Dom Helder Camara, a Brazilian archbishop who was assassinated in 1985. Quote, when I give food to the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why the poor have no food, they call me a communist. Hamilton went on to say, precisely because it is unfashionable and embarrassing to honour social justice, it is all the more necessary to do so. The underlying grounds for this claim are that each human being is precious and that the happiness, peace and development of each of us are dependent on others. And so, adulation of the self-made man is self-serving nonsense. Hamilton then affirmed the dignity of one and all as foundational to society. He went on that bereft even of the tribal instinct that prevent animals of the same species from feasting, he went on, but without that conviction, society basically falls apart. Hamilton concluded by saying that love is not a substitute for justice, but its lubricant. Without love, we will not be moved to address injustices. Pope Benedict spoke of love as the principal driving force behind the authentic development of every person and all humanity. Love of God and neighbour is foundational to the words and deeds of Jesus. The scriptural notion of philoxenia, or love of strangers or even enemies, is especially apt to this discussion. Of course, it is completed by the notion of agape, or one's personal loves, and again eros, or the love of the beautiful. Sadly, the good news of the love of God and neighbour was and is rejected as too good to be true. Jesus died rejected outside the city walls, between a so-called good and bad thief, stretched between life and death, between heaven and hell, promising new life. And yet in him the opposites were reconciled. At least that is what Christians claim when he rose from the dead. He is the Alpha and Omega, who always offers new life, a new beginning, despite the contrary observations of our constructs. We gather in goodwill tonight, invoking the Spirit Jesus promised. No doubt the Spirit is also with the frustrated, lonely and sick, displaced millions around the world. The scope and the numbers of displaced persons appear beyond resolution. Perhaps there is a deep down reconciliation that we are all in need of. Pope Paul pointed out, if we want justice, work for peace, and if you want peace, be ready to forgive. Forgiveness reveals the lifeblood of love as it did on the cross of Calvary. We need to move beyond short-term partisan policies to address the fundamental needs of people. In this context, I would suggest, and I think it's already been alluded to, that the right of religious freedom to affirm and support the dignity of all humans as created in the image of God is to the common good, whatever one's religious aspirations. Pope Francis, the Time magazine Man of the Year, has touched a chord with many by affirming a joy in their dignity. He speaks simple words, does simple acts, and engages universally. In a recent letter reflecting on the joy of the gospel, the joy of being in relationship with Jesus as both companion and shepherd, he spoke of the type of church he preferred, and I quote, "I prefer a church which is bruised, hurting and dirty, because it's been out on the streets, rather than a church that is unhealthy from being confined and clinging to its own security." His words should find a resonance with all Christians. Might I even suggest that one could substitute church with federal parliament, or even society. After all, we are talking about the vision that should underpin our foundational relationships. I raise this scenario on the eve of our nation's centenary commemoration of the Anzac landings. We live in vastly different times, though human aspirations are constant. How will future generations remember us? Hopefully not as the Aussies who thought it was cool to be cruel. And so to affirm that we are in it together, permit me to share the simple yet powerful claim of Bevans and Schroeder that, quote, that the mission has a church. Note, I did not say that the church has a mission, but that the mission has a church. Jesus came that we might have life and have it to the full. Together and only together can we do better. There are many challenges. The most obvious question is just why are there so many displaced persons and what can be done to reduce this? How do regional solutions see each country do their fair share of heavy lifting? Perhaps Australia could offer more community-based settlement schemes as were to the fore after the Vietnam War. More resources for the quicker expediting of asylum seeker claims and an increased intake of refugees. Whatever, the economic bottom line is not the sole determinant of our authentic development as the assassinated US Senator Robert Kennedy reminded us when he said, "The gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debates or the integrity of our public officials. It measures neither our will nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. And it can tell us everything about America or Australia, except why we are proud that we are Australians." In conclusion, I suggest that as proud Australians, we affirm, indeed claim, our sovereign responsibility and do better than the demeaning and divisive policy of sovereign borders. We could at least start there on a sea of challenges.
Thank you, Monsignor Woods. Next, I'd like to introduce Reverend Chris Turner. Reverend Turner came to Canberra from Melbourne 2 years ago to serve as Senior Minister at the Canberra Baptist Church, and he is also a doctoral student in the field of Australian contextual theology. Reverend Turner has been in ministry in Baptist churches for 13 years and has throughout that time encouraged Christians to respond to asylum seekers with love, justice and hospitality. In a letter published in the Canberra Times in 2013, Reverend Turner wrote that Australians need to question, and I quote, "whether current government policy on the processing of asylum seekers is making all of us as Australian citizens complicit in a great moral evil. Many of us feel helpless to do anything about it, but it is time for Australians to collectively resist the policy of this government." Reverend Turner's involvement with refugees and asylum seekers has been through providing assistance as opportunity has arisen to those granted asylum in Australia, using the resources and people available through the various churches with which he has ministered. Currently, the Canberra Baptist Church is active in its practical support of those granted asylum in Australia. Thank you, Reverend Turner.
I also want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Current Australian policies on the treatment of asylum seekers who attempt to arrive in Australia by boat are designed to manufacture a corporate cultural fear of the vulnerable stranger who comes to our shores in search of asylum. Fear is an emotion that has the capacity to give us impulsive permission to commit irrational and immoral acts of defensive cruelty. One way to foster fear is to dehumanise, in the eyes of the people, the human beings that are singled out as the objects of fear. Current policies are excelling, I would suggest, at dehumanising those who seek asylum by stepping into a boat in the minds of most Australians, calling such asylum seekers illegal, conjuring images of foreign invasion by using the language of border protection and sovereign borders, as we've heard, attempting to fight the crime of people smuggling by persecuting the victims of that crime, and tellingly covering the current offshore detention system in secrecy and silence. All encourage an easy sense of the boat people as subhuman and therefore acceptable objects of our defensive cruelty. And it's telling also that the boat people have now been reduced to the boats. What would Jesus say and do in this situation I'm going to presume an answer. Jesus was a religious teacher. The Gospel of Luke suggests that from a very young age he was demonstrating a deep and broad awareness of his own religious tradition, which was rooted in the Hebrew Bible. We know that his parables and his actions presented a prophetic challenge to the conventional religion and society that he was born into. It appears that the themes of justice, mercy, and common humanity with the vulnerable and the stranger that appear throughout the Hebrew Bible shaped Jesus' understanding of his religion and of the social situation in which he lived, and we've heard much about that already. One stunning declaration in the Hebrew Bible of God's demand for us to recognise our common humanity with the vulnerable other person is found in the book of Job, and I reckon Jesus would have read it through and through. Job declares his awareness of God's demand on him to acknowledge that the slave, a subclass in his household, shares his humanity. Quoting Job, did not he who made me in the womb make them? And did not one fashion us in the womb? If I have seen anyone perish for lack of clothing, or a poor person without covering, who was not warmed with the fleece of my sheep, then let my shoulder blade fall from my shoulder, and let my arm be broken from its socket. For I was in terror of calamity from God, and I could not have faced his majesty. Job has with absolute clarity recognised that he shares his humanity in common with all other people. All human beings are sacred in God's eyes, and we cannot hope to look God in the face if we have failed to recognise our common humanity with every person, if we have failed to offer every person the hospitality of our household. Traditions like this, I'm hazarding a guess, found their way into the parables and stories that Jesus shared with those who listened to him. And one key example that we've already heard read very creatively tonight, which has significant importance for tonight's question, the parable of the sheep and the goats in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 25. In that parable, the nations of the world stand before Jesus, the Son of Man, in judgment. And I'm assuming that one of those nations will be Australia. They are divided into two groups. The sheep stand to the right and the goats to the left. The key criterion for their judgment is the question of how they responded to the plight of the vulnerable stranger. To the sheep, Jesus offers this welcome and says, as we've heard, I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you gave me clothing. I was sick and you took care of me. I was in prison and you visited me. Now let's sit up and take note, because this is important. The sheep have no idea when or how this could have happened. They have no memory of doing these things for Jesus. Jesus' reply to their question is staggering in its implications for them. I tell you the truth. Whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. Jesus identified himself with the vulnerable stranger, with every vulnerable stranger, no matter their identity. There are no categories of vulnerability here. There is no distinction between legal strangers or illegal strangers. No distinction between those strangers who have arrived by boat or those who have arrived by Qantas Flight 529. The sheep in this parable were the nations who showed mercy to the vulnerable strangers at their borders. By identifying himself with every vulnerable stranger, Jesus made clear his understanding of God, the nature of God. When you look into the eyes of the vulnerable stranger, you are looking into the eyes of God. For me, there can be no doubt in our minds minds, or in my mind, when we read these parables of Jesus, that Jesus would respond to the asylum seeker, all asylum seeker, as if he were welcoming God's self. This perspective is diametrically opposed to the strategy of dehumanising the asylum seeker that is being implemented in Australia today. What would Jesus do? Jesus would love the vulnerable stranger in the full conviction that by doing so, he was loving God. By showing such an extravagant love, Jesus would make the full humanity of the vulnerable stranger clearly apparent to all who witnessed his love for them. Those who are looking on would get it. He loves them. They are human beings. When Jesus touched a man with leprosy, that man was revealed in his full humanity, no longer a social outcast. Jesus' love for the asylum seeker would work against the attempts of the nation state to dehumanise the asylum seeker. It would be a love of active, non-violent resistance to the nation state. Australia's wonderful humanist philosopher Raymond Gaita put it like this: the readiness of lovers to disregard prudence, to love and to suffer for it, despite status, class, race, nationality and moral merit, conditions and awakens in us a sense of the mystery and preciousness of human beings. As witnesses to the imprudent love of Jesus for the vulnerable stranger, we must awaken to the sacred, mysterious preciousness of every single human person who approaches us in need. And if we allow Jesus' love to awaken our own love for the vulnerable stranger, then our love will reveal the full humanity of the vulnerable stranger, the asylum seeker, and awaken love in the lives of every Australian person and transform them, Australians, into imprudent lovers of the vulnerable stranger. And then love will overcome fear. Common humanity will overcome inhumanity. And justice, mercy, and love will characterise our national identity. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Turner. And our final speaker tonight is Eileen O'Brien from the Refugee Action Committee. Eileen has made Australia her home since 1974 when she migrated here from the United States. She is retired from a career in the community service sector where she worked in a range of services providing support to socially disadvantaged people, including migrants and refugees. Eileen has been a long-time opponent of Australia's policy of mandatory detention for asylum seekers. It was the introduction of the PNG solution that moved her to get actively involved in the Refugee Action Committee campaign to press our government to honour its obligations to give refuge to asylum seekers and to treat them with dignity and humanity. Thank you, Eileen.
Thanks, Karen. But following a Baptist minister, how's that for a tough gig? Nonetheless, what should we do? We hear very often from politicians and commentators in relation to the issue of the votes that it's a very complex issue, very complex. The Australian people have not been encouraged at all to find out what's really going on, to understand the issue. It's too complex. Well, no, it isn't. It's about right and wrong. It's about the right way to treat our fellow human beings and the wrong way. It's about Australia, what Australia can do as a rich, modern democracy to help people desperately in need. and what it is now choosing to do instead. It's about our obligations under the UN Refugee Convention and what it chooses to do instead. Signatories to the UN Refugee Convention accept three primary responsibilities: to offer asylum protection to asylum seekers, to consider their claims for asylum, and to not return them to danger. Our current policy, in fact, is doing quite the opposite. It is refusing asylum and turning boats back. Manus Island has been in operation for 16 months, and not one claim for detention has yet been completed. There are no plans for resettlement for those people. We are returning people to danger, sometimes through forcible deportations, and more by making the conditions for asylum seekers so unbearable that they agree to repatriation. And so we ask ourselves, what should we do? What we need to do, I say, is get informed, find out what's happening, what we're doing to people, get involved, and be prepared for a long struggle for change. Facts have been pretty thin on the ground on this issue in the political debate and the media coverage. And there's a lot of misinformation out there. An argument that has been used to defend the current harsh policies is that we had to do something to stop the boats. This is all about saving lives. It's the only way. So we're told. These tough policies are not the only way. Australia is the only country in the world that has indefinite mandatory detention for all asylum seekers. No other country finds the need to do this. Everyone agrees that the deaths at sea have been tragic and must be avoided. We could stop those drownings by removing the need for the people in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in Sri Lanka to get on boats. If there's not the need, they don't get on boats. What we need to be doing is processing their claims for asylum where they are, quickly, efficiently, by making their lives endurable where they are, giving them safety and security where they are while their claims are being processed. People would not undertake what they know are dangerous sea journeys if they had any alternative. People with no hope have nothing to lose. Everyone agrees that what is needed are workable, cooperative, regional arrangements for receiving asylum seekers and efficiently processing their claims for refugee status. Everyone agrees on that. All three of our major political parties, refugee advocates, the UN, the Gillard government's expert panel on asylum seeker policy. But by its current actions, entering into bilateral agreements with Papua New Guinea, Nauru, and now maybe Cambodia, the Australian government is obstructing any potential for cooperative, regional, multilateral agreement. For examples of other ways to treat refugees, we only have to look at how we used to do it. As was mentioned, after the Second World War, after the Vietnam War, Australia accepted refugees in large numbers, over 200,000 after the Second World War, over 70,000 after the Vietnam War. Their claims for asylum were processed in Europe or in Southeast Asia, where the refugee camps were. Australia had reception centers, not detention centers, reception centers, where people had their initial health, security, and identity checks, and then they were settled into the community while they waited for their claims to be processed. They were often initially billeted with Australian families. They were welcomed into the community. Or, for examples, we can look at how the rest of the world is dealing with the influx of refugees, asylum seekers today. Let's take Jordan, for example. Jordan is a little bit bigger than Tasmania. It has a population of 6.5 million, and it has a GDP that's a fraction of Australia's. In addition to already housing over 30,000 Iraqi refugees from the Gulf Wars, it is now hosting 600,000 Syrians who are arriving by the thousands every day. When those asylum seekers reach the Jordanian border, they're met by the Jordanian army, by members of the Jordanian army, not to turn them away, to assist them to complete their journey, understanding that they're weary and they need help, just as Jesus would have, I suggest. In 2012, the Gillard government set up its expert panel on asylum seekers to receive submissions and then report on the best way forward for Australia's refugee policy. It is worth noting that 290 of the 340 submissions it received, that's 86%, recommended against the reopening of Manus Island or Nauru, and warned in detail of the serious risks in this policy setting. One wonders how the panel then arrived at its recommendation to reopen Manus Island and Nauru, when the overwhelming expert advice warned them against it. The so-called PNG solution clearly was a political fix. Of course, the primary focus of our concern must be the unacceptable, unfair, and inhumane treatment of refugees. But we might also want to consider what it's doing to us, what this experience is doing to us as a nation and who we are as a people. What does it say about what we value and what we find acceptable? Australians like to see themselves as warm, welcoming, and generous. We're the land of the fair go. But we now, so it appears, endorse policies that intentionally deny refugees of their human rights and are intentionally cruel, unfair. Is that what we find acceptable? And so, what should we do with this anger and frustration that now does seem to be growing after the horrific events of Manus Island last week? Well, talk with your family and friends about this. Break the silence. Dispel the myths about refugees and asylum seekers. Most people do change their minds when they know the facts. Organize a group from your church or your neighborhood or family to attend our rally in April. Get your youth groups involved. Organize a project for your school. And come along and get involved with the Refugee Action Committee. Tonight is your point of contact. Come and see us afterwards over tea or coffee. Fill in one of our sign-up sheets. Everyone can contribute in some way to whatever extent you are able. I'll re-emphasize that RAC is nonpartisan. This is not a political issue. It's not a left-right issue. It's a humanitarian issue that requires us all to work together. I'd like to close by addressing just a few words to my fellow seniors here tonight, to encourage you to take seriously our role as the elders in this community. This is not the time to stand back and say, oh, what can I do? I don't want to make a fuss. I don't want to draw attention to myself. No, this is the time to stand up and say, pay attention. What our country is doing is wrong, and something has to be done about it. Help support the work of the Refugee Action Committee, and yes, that might mean marching in the streets. Why not? What have you got to lose? Your reputation? Certainly at this time in our lives, we understand it really doesn't matter what other people think. It's what we do, and we do it because we know we're right. It's not fair for us to think we can leave this to the young people. No, not good enough. We all have to work together. Our part as elders is important. So in conclusion, I'll say to all of you, please consider getting involved and help us work toward more humane refugee policy. We know we're in for a long battle against a formidable opponent in entrenched government policy and public opinion. But we know we're right, and we know from experience that ongoing, persistent public action will get effects. It will be effective. We just have to persist. And remember, to quote the title of a book by Christian author Joyce Meyer, you can't defeat Goliath with your mouth shut.